Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my delight and joy to welcome you to the forum where each week we explore important issues at the intersection of faith and the modern world. Today we are talking about that all-important issue called money, and we are honored to have with us Donald Romanik. He and his wife Margaret are members of the St. Bart's community. Donald has served as the Episcopal Church Foundation's president and CEO since 2005. He is the author of Beyond the Baptismal Covenant, Transformational Lay Leadership for the Episcopal Church in the 21st Century, and his new book, Money Legacies, about which he will be talking today. Donald, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the kind invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. Margaret and I are members of three parishes, St. Bart's in New York, Trinity Church in Hartford, Connecticut, and Church of the Heavenly Rest in Abilene, Texas, where our son is rector. They refer to this Heavenly Rest as the other Heavenly Rest. So, but anyway, it's a pleasure being here with you. Let me start with a quote from Matthew. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." When the senior editor at Church Publishing asked me to write a little book on faith and money, and it is a little book. It's a series. It's about 18,000 words. It's about 100 pages, an easy read. I think a lot of books out there, especially those around like leadership and business, are probably 350 pages too long. So this is just about right. I didn't want to write just another book about making money holy or stewardship. I wanted to write a book about telling stories. As I get older, I find stories to be incredibly compelling. I think stories are the way we communicate who we are, what we're thinking, what we're feeling about. And just thinking about, the news coverage of the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion, they'll have these wonderful newscasters talking about what's happening there. But the most compelling part is when you hear the stories of the individuals who are displaced, who are evacuated, especially the children. For me, that's what the war is all about. I mean, obviously you want to hear about kind of tactical things that are going on. Stories are embedded in our Judeo-Christian heritage. The Bible is full of stories. And we tend to prefer those books in the Bible that are stories as opposed to teachings or precepts. We hear the stories about creation and floods and slavery and liberation and ultimately redemption and resurrection. We love telling our own stories. We tell stories about our jobs, our travels. Restaurants in New York, you love to talk about your favorite restaurants, our kids, grandchildren. Our liturgy of the word is about stories. And some of the most compelling sermons we hear are usually incorporate stories. And we're gifted with wonderful preachers here at St. Bart's, but Dean Wolfe has a wonderful way of telling a story in the context of his sermon. And when we invite newcomers into the community, we often ask them some questions like, tell us your story. What was your faith tradition growing up? Why are you looking for a church home? Or even if we're really bold, tell us about your spiritual journey. But what if we ask them other questions? If we ask questions like, what was your family's financial situation growing up? How did your family express its values the way it spent money? When did you first learn or appreciate the value of a dollar? Do you consider yourself a spender or a saver? Or tell us about your money story. Tell us about your financial journey. Wow, taboo. In the Episcopal Church, we will share the most intimate details of our lives, our personal relationships, our politics, our surgeries, our cancer treatments, but we won't talk about money. What is it about money that's such a taboo in the church? We all know that Jesus talked about money more than any other subject except the kingdom of heaven. And he often compared the kingdom of heaven using parables involving money. And we all know some of the stories, and probably the most compelling and the most challenging is when he tells the rich young man, when the young man asks Jesus what he needs to do to be saved, Jesus tells him to sell all his belongings and give them away, because it's easier for the camel to pass through the eye of the needle than a rich man to get into heaven. Wow, that's heavy stuff. And without getting into a lot of a biblical analysis, I think what Jesus is saying is that in order to be his follower, we have to come to grips with all the impediments that prevent us from having a relationship with God. And one of them is money. I think we all would agree that money is, and how we spend it, is a clear indication of our values. Our monthly credit card and debit card statements say more about who we are than any other document. One of the things I do every year is go through all, getting ready for tax time, going through the checkbook and all. And it's amazing. I'll ask Margaret, what did we spend $354.27 on for XYZ? And of course, she has it at the top of her head. I'll say, okay. Money is at the heart of who we are and how we express ourselves and what we value, especially in American society. And ultimately, money is at the heart of who we are as Christians. And the fundamental premise that since God created everything, everything we have and own ultimately belongs to God. And that is what stewardship's about, caring and nurturing all those aspects of God's creation, especially those for whom we have the most important and probably the most controlling role, and that is money. But before we can practice Christian stewardship, and here's my premise. We ask our members, we ask all of us to embrace Christian stewardship as a way of life, give back to God, including supporting the wonderful ministries of our local faith communities. But I think we're putting the cart before the horse. We have to help our people confront, embrace, and come to grips with that incredible concept called money. And to start articulating and thinking about what are the obstacles that prevent us from giving back to an all-generous God. I believe that talk leads to action, and we're talking about a lot of heavy stuff right now in the church, especially around racial reconciliation and anti-racism and the historic role of the church in perpetuating these evils in our society. And ultimately, talk leads to action. So why not facilitate conversations among ourselves at the personal level, with our spouses and partners, with our friends, and with our faith community about our attitudes toward money? I firmly believe that each of us has a personal money story that stems from our family of origin and continues to shape how we view money, how we spend it, how we save it, our attitudes toward generosity, toward stewardship, our attitudes toward life as we grow up. I also believe that our economic situation as children shapes our attitude toward economics and finances the rest of our life, even if our circumstances change. In other words, if we grew up in a fairly modest financial background, That modesty stays with us forever, even as we accumulate kind of wealth and economic privilege. Similarly, if we grow privileged and our economic situation changes, we still have that sense of, I think, entitlement. And I use that word not judgmentally, but kind of realistically. And we bring these money personalities to our relationships, to our families, to our workplaces, to our church communities. Parishes also have their money stories, especially the parishes here in New York City. You know, most of the Episcopal parishes here, I mean, they have, you know, quite a kind of a past filled with kind of wealth, power, and prestige. And a lot of the circumstances and demographics have changed. But they're still kind of in the walls of these old historic buildings. They're the money stories that actually they need to come out. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In reality, rather than being none of the church's business, money is the church's business because it goes to the heart of who we are as Christians, as pilgrims on the journey, as would-be disciples, and as faith communities trying to bring Jesus to a broken world. Money is at the heart of everything, and we as a church have to embrace it, deal with it, because money is not inherently bad or good. It's something we have to deal with, we have to steward, we have to talk about it, and we have to kind of adjust our attitudes so we can be more loving, giving, generous disciples. I tell my money story in some detail in my book. And as I was writing that chapter, it was basically the story of me and my family over the years, using the kind of lens of money. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I was raised in a Polish-American Roman Catholic parish, St. Stanislaus. My father, my grandfather, my three uncles worked for Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the rifle that won the West. My father never finished high school. He was a factory worker his entire life, worked his way up through the union ranks, and provided us with a good life. But we were also subject to the vagaries of overtime, not lack of overtime, the vagaries of the economics of the 1950s and 60s. I remember the value of a dime. Now, a dime is worth nothing right now. But a dime, dimes are what I threw in the collection basket in church. Dimes, even now, dimes like tingle when they hit a rough surface. Mrs. McCoy, my mother's friend, used to kiss me and put a dime in my hand. I talk about my mother's budget envelopes. I don't know if people remember budget envelopes where you actually took cash and put it in different envelopes in a portfolio on the various economic, financial obligations of the week. And I talk about my grandmother, my immigrant grandmother, Katie Paterak, who emigrated here at age 16, an orphan, worked as a domestic, worked for a loving, embracing Jewish family who invested her money and sent her to citizenship class. She marries another immigrant from Poland who served in World War I, subject to mustard gas, then in a mine and then a foundry, and died at 42. And my grandmother raised two children, two daughters on her own, which was pretty rare in those days, including my mother, who had tuberculosis as a child and spent 4 years in the sanitarium. My mother's going to be 100 this September. But my grandmother taught me a combination of thrift, hard work, and generosity. You know, I used to hear stories from people saying, oh, your grandmother, you can show up at 2 o'clock in the morning and she would have food and drink and hospitality and laughter. And she was incredibly generous. I mean, she left me a small sum of money, But in 1979, 1976, almost put me through 3 years of law school at Boston University. I continue to tell the story about Margaret and me, talk about thrift, thrifty Polish background, a thrifty Scottish background. To say we were thrifty is probably understating. But how you raise your children with the sense of hard work, not overspending, but always being generous. And as I look back at that chapter, and I reread it this morning, I found out that it wasn't only about money. It was about how I've progressed as a professional, as a husband, as a father, through my various careers, and how I continue to struggle with issues around money, generosity, and stewardship. And there's still times when I'll go back to those days where spending $10 or the equivalent thereof of lunch was like, wow, that's a lot of money. I tell the stories of the parishes Margaret and I have been involved with, including St. Bart's, although my editor said, don't put the names in, let them figure it out themselves. And I'll talk about money stories of parishes. I encourage local faith communities to facilitate conversations about money among their members and to start at the top. And there's a lot of, practical how-to, probably a little too much in some respects, but I felt that if I was going to throw out this, I think somewhat controversial proposition, I have to give people some idea how I might want to do it. It's difficult and challenging. As I said, we can have forums on all kinds of other topics. Grief, sickness, all kinds of stuff. But this is most challenging because I challenge us to find someone in this room we don't know and tell them what our net worth is or what our adjusted gross income was for last year. We'll tell them about our children, our grandchildren, our divorces, our relationships, our travels, even our sicknesses. And consequently, this conversation needs to be done thoughtfully, prayerfully, and without judgment or guilt, because especially if we're looking back at our families of origin, we were not responsible for our economic situation as kids. We are responsible for what we do with those economic gifts as we age and as we become faithful, loving members of society and the community. And I'm not advocating that, we get up, we ask people to tell their money stories, the same details I have, although I enjoy doing it. And I feel like I've exposed myself in a lot of respects, but it's also helped me come to grips with my attitudes about money, generosity, stewardship, community involvement as I approach this next phase of my life, sometimes called retirement in some circles. And there's some ideas, some playful ways on how you might do that. And I for those who want to read the book, I commend it to you all. But why do you do this? Why tell personal money stories? We don't spend enough time on the why. And especially when it comes to fundraising and stewardship, we need to spend a whole lot of time on why before we get to the what. Why? Pastoral. As people tell their money stories, we may find out, as we never knew, that someone lost a job, has significant debt. When people tell their money stories, even in fairly simple ways, we learn a lot about what their needs may be and what they need from a local faith community. Fellowship. We all want to know about each other. The whole idea of coming to church to develop friendships and connections. And just having a conversation about how you grew up or where you grew up or what your father did or whatever. It's a way of enhancing those personal relationships. Stewardship. we expect people to be incredibly generous in giving without knowing their money stories. That's a challenge. If we get a sense of where people are coming from, we know how to approach, especially if we're talking about major capital campaigns or major gifts. You can sit down with someone saying, gee, Donald, I know your story. I knew you grew up of modest means, and now you have some. How do you want to give back and honor that wonderful grandmother of yours who was so generous and so loving? Leadership. Now, this is a little, probably the most provocative. If someone has an unhealthy relationship with money, do we want them to be treasurer? Or, if we know that there's a curmudgeon at the vestry or the finance committee who says no, no, no to any expenditure, it might be helpful to know that he grew up without anything and is still concerned about lacking or want rather than abundance. And discipleship. Discipleship, it does not happen automatically. It is a gradual process that involves significant formation. And I think helping people grasp their own attitudes towards money and economics and generosity is part of that journey toward discipleship. And why tell money stories of congregations? History. The Episcopal Church, the Christian Church, the entire history of the Christian Church from Constantine on is about money, power, and prestige. The entire history of the Episcopal Church in New York City is about power, money, and prestige. We need to hear that story. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us are watching Gilded Age, which is kind of amusing and interesting, although apparently not totally historically accurate. But although those people were obviously excessive in a lot of respects, we would not have our churches or the Metropolitan Museum or a lot of the landmarks of New York without this generosity. And our secular institutions talk about their history. They celebrate these, people who were these first families who endowed them and built them because they know that it helps newer people kind of be generous and involved. Transparency. And I'm very proud of the fact that St. Bart's has been incredibly transparent with our finances, especially recently. It's an important part of the responsibility of faith communities to their members and constituents. Stewardship and fundraising, I mentioned that. If you tell the story about this place, and there's still people still think, oh, you belong to that rich church on Park Avenue. I said, I belong to that church on Park Avenue that has some resources, but incredible ministries that need all of our support. That's a compelling thing to say. And without that history, people might think that we're sitting on a $100 million endowment and we can do anything we want at any time. Transitions, especially during clergy leadership changes. The money story is important. And I think no clergy person worth their salt at this stage of the game is going to take any rector or vicar or priest in charge position without knowing the money story of that community. And sustainability. For better or for worse, financial resources are key to whether a congregation is sustainable in the future. You can have the most dynamic leadership, the most active ministries, the best buildings in the world, but unless there's money to sustain that, there's not going to be a long-term future. And I know telling money stories of congregations could also be controversial, because often it involves, kind of dredging up the past, because every congregation has had leaders, clergy and lay leaders who either may have not been the best stewards of money, especially when it came to endowments. But it's okay to say, yes, maybe we were a little spendthrift with our endowments in the 60s and 70s, but we are not. But we have changed our ways, and now we are raising money for current ministries and future ministries. It's a compelling argument, especially if you want people to contribute significantly going forward. So here are some quick next steps. Begin with prayer and Bible study. And fortunately, there are about 100 passages you can use in the Bible on talking about money. Ask the question, why? We don't spend enough time on why. Why do you come to church? Why does St. Bart's exist? Why you should give, rather than the what and the how. The logistics will come. Let's talk about the why. Recognize that talking about money can be difficult, but be clear about your intent. You can say, yeah, we're talking about stewardship. No, we're talking about money. And it may be uncomfortable, but that's what we're doing today. And, we're going to be gentle, we're going to be loving, we're going to be prayerful, but we're talking about money, folks. Start at the top. Vestry, leadership. Maybe they should share their money stories with us before we do as well. And make sure that you coordinate. It's helpful to coordinate the individual storytelling with the institutional storytelling. There are creative ways of doing that. The process must be presented as a spiritual exercise and not as a ruse for just getting more money. Back to my original premise. Money is at the heart of who we are as Christians because it helps us articulate and identify our values and what is important. Talking about money is a spiritual exercise. Yes, it may result in enhanced stewardship, God willing, a greater awareness, a greater involvement, but it's a spiritual exercise. Expect pushbacks and setbacks. Yeah, people are going to say, really? I'm not going to tell my money story. Okay, you don't have to. But just bear with us. Help us do this process. And I think telling money stories is also a way of developing a year-round approach to generosity and stewardship and fundraising. And I even have some suggestions in the book on how because what we often do is, we get to that September, October, November, December, or January, February. That's when we get like, oh my God, we need to talk about money. Start talking about money as soon as those pledge cards are in. After you thank people 3 times. 3 times is the magic number. You call them, leave a message on their cell phone. You write them the formal note, and you write them a little handwritten note. Thank you for your contribution and your pledge. Conversations about money are about individual stories. They're about resilience. They're about courage. They're about immigration. They're about the American dream. And I realized, when I look back at my own life, I realized that, I had immigrant grandparents, but they were white, and at that point, America needed unskilled laborers, and they welcomed them in. Give me your tired and your poor. I realized there have been aspects of white privilege as I progressed through the economic system. The American dream is clearly fractured, but it's not broken if we all open ourselves up to helping and walking along people on this journey. And I think telling our money stories is one way of doing that. Money stories are intimate details about hopes, dreams, tragedies, and triumph. They are about life, death, birth, and ultimately transformation. I'll stop now and see if there are questions or comments or pushbacks.
Thank you so much, Donald. I love that. I love the book. And I do have several questions. I want to open it also up to your questions. If you're in the room, you can fill out a question card and hand it to Excel Baguma, who's in the back, and she will make sure it gets to me. If you're online or if you're in the room, you can also submit your questions via Facebook, YouTube, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org, pthompson@stbarts.org. In a second, I'll hand it over to our rector, Bishop Dean Wolf, because I know he wanted to ask you a question and say something. I'm wondering, can you tell us what the St. Bart's money story is? You write about it a little bit in the book. I know you've been around a while. I wonder if you can share your reflections on that.
Oh, wow. Well, obviously, in the book, I kind of reflect on the controversy in the early '80s about the whole development and the preservation issues. I guess, again, I don't know a whole lot of details, and I do have a caveat saying, these are my reflections of the money stories of these congregations. I think there was a time when, some of the most kind of dynamic leaders often are dynamic and charismatic because they do things that people see. And I can point to a variety of people, throughout the city, throughout the country, who, after their tenure, people have to regroup and say, oh my goodness, we've had 7, 8, 9, 10% draws on our endowment. A lot of the big givers were, it was more kind of a cult of personality. I'm not naming names here, but I'm just saying, I think what has happened, especially with this current administration, is that we're going back to basics, saying, hey folks, we have this incredible place, but we have significant financial challenges. And in order for us to be at the crossroads of Manhattan, we need your support. We need the support of the wider community. And I think ultimately, that is the kind of leadership we're looking for in the church as we move into this next iteration. Because just saying everything would be fine and God will provide is not going to sustain the incredible ministries of this place or any place else.
Okay. Does the current administration wish to speak?
Donald, thank you so much for being here. We like to put our parishioners to work whenever we can. You and I come from similar backgrounds in terms of having come from kind of working class families that were trying to get their kids through college and kind of the next level. Do you think that makes it harder for us as Christian givers, or do you think that makes it easier?
I think it's a combination. I think there are times when I think it's like, gee, I have some money now, but you never know what's going to happen. I think there's always that. And again, the overtime issue. And for people who don't know kind of blue collar stuff. So my father, you work 40 hours and you get straight time. And he worked an extra 10, 12 hours a week at overtime, a time and a half. And that's a significant enhancement to your income. But that's not guaranteed. I mean, the Winchesters had the M14, which is a service rifle in the early days of Vietnam. That goes away. All of a sudden, your income drops. Imagine now your income drops by whatever, 30, 40%. The interesting thing is, though, our younger son, who is a development professional in Richmond, one point he said to us, he said, Dad and Mom, I don't think you give away enough money. Now, I don't know how old he was at that point. Probably he's 30 now, maybe. He wasn't a development person at that point? And it's like...
It's always good to have a spouse in the room to correct our stories.
But here was our son, who said, given your income level, you all have to give away more money. And out of the mouth of babes. And we have, could we give away more? Of course. Yeah. But so you think about, okay, facing retirement in another 10 or 20 years, right? I think what we have to do, people who grew up in kind of these circumstances, we have to fall back on how our families were loving and generous with what they had, rather than kind of, the thrift is important. And I think if we connect with that, then we look at what we have and what we need to give back.
Yeah. As a person who works in the wider church, who runs the Episcopal Church Foundation, who sees a lot of different models, what kinds of things do you see that you might hope St. Bart's might emulate, or maybe I should say, what kinds of things do you see that you hope St. Bart's doesn't choose to do?
Well, I think first of all, now you hear this, but we need to make sure we have a very active plan giving program, because we have a core group of people who are, we're all going to live forever because we're just going to keep getting our body parts replaced. But ultimately, that's going to end. So a lot of people who are currently generous, a lot of the gray hairs in the room, need to make sure that St. Bart's is in their estate plan. And when people ask, how much should I leave the church? 25 times your current pledge. So if you're pledging $1,000, because the whole idea of 3 or 4% draw, so you can endow your pledge, which is another way. I think engaging, even though it's at a different level, all the people who are connected to us online, even if it's $25 a month or $250 a year, engaging them and giving on a regular basis. Yeah. Because alumni funds at colleges, universities, as kids graduate from college, they want to get that $25 contribution in year one, so by your 25th reunion, you're giving $2,500 or $25,000. So, yeah. And I think the other thing, and I know you say it, but be a little more overt about talking about money and the need for people to support this place.
Yeah. We have Jema Tung here, who is our new stewardship and development person. I'd be remiss if I didn't say she'd love to have a conversation with people about these kinds of things, as would any member of the staff. Peter, do you have questions coming in?
Yes. So we have one question. Money, when it's used as a weapon, can you reflect at all, both within church communities and beyond?
Well, yeah. Well, the classic example of money as a weapon is pledgers, even major pledgers saying, I'm going to walk and pull my pledge if you do this or don't do this. And the worst thing you can do is have, I would say I'd rather have 100 $1,000 pledges than one $100,000 pledge. But God, if we have $100,000 pledges and more, God bless them, we want them. And I think often that's the classic example of being used in the church community. The other thing is, in the old days, the vestry had the purse strings, and the rector was responsible for everything else. And often the vestry, the way they would express their displeasure would be withholding budgetary money from him, because at that point it was him. I think what's happening now is the lay and clergy leadership are partners in all aspects of the life of the congregation. I think like anything, when you use anything as a weapon, and whether it's money or food or sex or whatever, you nip it in the bud right away. And you call people on it and say, really? Even if people make gratuitous comments, well, I'm walking, or you're not going to get my pledge next year, or we're not going to fund that particular program because it's Donald Romanik's favorite program, and I'm kind of pissed at him right now. Yeah, we use, and in the church, we're not that overt about it. We'll say, well, priorities have changed, and just so happens that it's your favorite program. I didn't know it was your favorite program. Yeah. You like Crossroads? Anyway, so yeah, but you have to get it early in the process.
Yeah.
There's another question about some people give to the needy, to feeding the hungry, etc. Others give to the building and the music and the staff. And is there such a distinction, and how do you advise folks in terms of navigating such a distinction?
Well, the generational change in philanthropy, and you probably know this as well, is that aging baby boomers will give, to the American Red Cross or St. Bartholomew's Church. Newer philanthropists want to give to a particular program, and they want to get involved in the program. So it's often kids at risk or music. I think part of the process is that, yes, we know you love, but every program has overhead, or you don't use that word, but every program needs support to make it run. And that's why I'm a firm believer in kind of narrative budgets or program budgets, which in this case so everyone in the organization, all of your salaries and benefits, everyone is attached to a program, rather than pure administration. People don't want to give to pure administration. But if 20% of your time is dedicated to worship, you put that in the worship budget. Whatever, so that obviously you need a line budget for auditing and budget purposes. But the pie chart shows that everyone who works here is involved in those 5, 6, 7 areas of ministry. And whether it's, outreach, hospitality, food ministry, whatever. That's another way of looking at it.
It gives me an opportunity to talk about I don't know if it's my favorite conversation, but it's one I keep coming back to. We have a number of people who are very generous to a variety of institutions, for which I also have affection. My alma mater writes me with great regularity inviting me to give, and they have a staff of between 100 and 200 people that makes a very sophisticated series of asks over the years, as do hospitals, as do other nonprofits. The church very often does not have that level of staffing. At St. Bart's, we have one person, and we hope to have a second person, and we have a rector and clergy assisting, but it's really a small thing. So what I want to remind people is that every hospital that I can think of, every research institute, every school found its origins in the church. That the genesis of all of those came at the church is the engine that provides the wherewithal for those to exist. And I want to remind people to prioritize the church in their giving.
And that's where the stories come in. Everyone here has a story of how this place touches them. And I just know I'm going to point, Margaret's connection to Crossroads and the food pantry, and how that is an important program for her in her retirement and being here in New York. We all have to, telling our stories, I mean, you clearly have to make that connection.
Yeah.
But a simple story of what this place means to me.
Yeah.
Or one of our clients or constituents, or someone who just walks by here and kind of just marvels at the building. You get a 30-second video about it. So.
We're out of time, but I'll fit one more question in. How do we talk to our kids about money?
Oh, that's a good question. I think you have to be open and honest about money. And if people say, are we rich? Well, we're not rich, but we're comfortable. I remember back to James, when he was a freshman in high school, freshman in college, he had 2 issues. One was, are we going to be okay putting him through college? And our point is, yeah, we plan for this. And second is, where am I going to get health insurance when I graduate? Now, he's a kind of a weird, kind of extraordinary kid. But yeah, I think kids need to know the value of a dollar. I mean, that's the whole allowance issue. Or, yes, they'll say, this meal cost $100. Yes, it did. And we realized that other people don't necessarily have food, but we thought this was a celebration that warranted this kind of expenditure. Open and honest. I mean, they don't have to see your tax returns, although James probably has.
And I'd just say, make sure you do talk to your children about money, that almost any conversation you would have is the beginning of a rich dialogue.
And you want them to have healthy attitudes toward money. Even, especially, a lot of us, I would say, probably have more significant means than not. That is also an important conversation, and the idea of giving back. So,
Donald, thank you so much for being here and for sharing and being vulnerable about sharing your story. Thank you.
So, yes, applause. Thank you so much, Donald. Two quick plugs as we end. First, Donald's book, Money Legacies, is available at the Bookstore, so you can take a look at that before you leave, and maybe you can even catch Donald and have him sign one for you. The second is Donald and Dean already mentioned our Director of Stewardship and Development, Jema Tung. She's right there at the front. And in terms of building your own money legacy, you kind of knew this was coming. We are in the process of preparing for our annual Mosaic Society Luncheon. Those are folks who do make planned gifts to St. Bart's, and Jema would be very interested in talking to you if you'd like to know more about that or about pledge season or anything else. Wanted to make sure I pointed Jema out to you. If you're watching online, you can email Jema, jtung at stbarts.org, jtoung at stbarts.org. Thank you all for being here. Next week, Meredith Ward will be joined in conversation by Rabbi Sarah Berman from our neighboring Central Synagogue. We'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you.